Tulagi further information. Invasion of Tulagi, May 1942. Early on 3rd May, Shima's force arrived off Tulagi and began disembarking the naval troops to occupy the island. Tulagi was undefended. The small garrison of Australian commandos and a Royal Australian Air Force reconnaissance unit evacuated just before Shima's arrival. The Japanese forces immediately began construction of a seaplane and communications base. Aircraft from Shōkaku covered the landings until early afternoon, when Goto's force turned towards Bougainville to refuel in preparation to support the landings at Port Moresby. At 17 War on 3rd May, Fletcher was notified that the Japanese Tulagi invasion force had been sighted the day before, approaching the southern Solomons. Unknown to Fletcher, TF-11 completed refueling that morning ahead of schedule and was only 60 mmi, 69 metriimi, on 10 kilometers east of TF-17, but was unable to communicate its status because of Fletcher's orders to maintain radio silence. TF-17 changed course and proceeded at 27 Ken 31 MEP, 50 km H, towards Guadalcanal to launch airstrikes against the Japanese forces at Tulagi the next morning. On 4th May, from a position 100 nmi, 120 to me, 190 kilometers south of Guadalcanal, 11-10s, 158-49 E, a total of 60 aircraft from TF-17 launched 3 consecutive strikes against Shima's forces off Tulagi. Yorktown's aircraft surprised Shima's ships and sank the destroyer Kikuzuki Aero 9°07's 160-20 E, and 3 of the minesweepers, damaged 4 other ships, and destroyed 4 seaplanes which were supporting the landings. The U.S. lost 1 torpedo bomber and 2 fighters in the strikes, but all of the aircrew were eventually rescued. After recovering its aircraft late in the evening of 4th May, TF-17 retired towards the south. In spite of the damage suffered in the carrier strikes, the Japanese continued construction of the seaplane base and began flying reconnaissance missions from Tulagi by 6 May. Takagi's carrier striking force was refueling 350 nmi, 400 mi, 650 kilometers north of Tulagi when it received word of Fletcher's strike on 4th May. Takagi terminated refueling, headed southeast, and sent scout planes to search east of the Solomons, believing that the U.S. carriers were in that area. Since no Allied ships were in that area, the search planes found nothing. At 08:16 on 5th May, TF-17 rendezvoused with TF-11 and TF-44 at a predetermined point 320 nmi, 370 milliopounds, 590 kilometers south of Guadalcanal, 15 degrees 160 E. At about the same time, 4 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters from Yorktown intercepted a Kawanishi H-6K reconnaissance flying boat from the Yokohama Air Group of the 25th Air Flotilla, based at the Shortland Islands, and shot it down 11 nmi, 13 mets, 20 kilometers from TF-11. The aircraft failed to send a report before it crashed, but when it didn't return, to base the Japanese correctly assumed that it had been shot down by carrier aircraft. A message from Pearl Harbor notified Fletcher that radio intelligence deduced the Japanese planned to land their troops at Port Moresby on 10 May and their fleet carriers would likely be operating close to the invasion convoy. Armed with this information, Fletcher directed TF-17 to refuel from Neosho. After the refueling was completed on 6 May, he planned to take his forces north towards the Louisiades and do battle on 7 May. In the meantime, Takagi's carrier force steamed down the east side of the Solomons throughout the day on 5 May, turned west to pass south of San Cristobal, Makira, and entered the Coral Sea after transiting between Guadalcanal and Rennell Island in the early morning hours of 6 May. Takagi commenced refueling his ships 180 nmi, 210 meter, 330 km west of Tulagi, in preparation for the carrier battle he expected would take place the next day. On 6 May, Fletcher absorbed TF-11 and TF-44 into TF-17. Believing the Japanese carriers were still well to the north near Bougainville, Fletcher continued to refuel. Reconnaissance patrols conducted from the U.S. carriers throughout the day failed to locate any of the Japanese naval forces. Because they were located just beyond scouting range at Tenfu, a Kawanishi reconnaissance flying boat from Tulagi sighted TF-17 and notified its headquarters. Takagi received the report at 10:50. At that time, Takagi's force was about 300 NMEI, 350 meters, 560 kilometers north of Fletcher, near the maximum range for his carrier aircraft. Takagi, whose ships were still refueling, was not yet ready to engage in battle. He concluded, based on the sighting report, TF-17 was heading south and increasing the range. Furthermore, Fletcher's ships were under a large, low-hanging overcast which Takagi and Hara felt would make it difficult for their aircraft to find the U.S. carriers. Takagi detached his 2 carriers with 2 destroyers under Hara's command to head towards TF-17 at 20 kn, 23 impa, 37 km/h, in order to be in position to attack at first light the next day while the rest of his ships completed refueling. US B-17 bombers based in Australia and staging through Port Moresby attacked the approaching Port Moresby invasion forces, including Goto's warships, several times during the day on 6th of May without success. MacArthur's headquarters radioed Fletcher with reports of the attacks and the locations of the Japanese invasion forces. MacArthur's flyers reports of seeing a carrier, Shōkaku, about 425 NMI, 489 meticulously, 787 kilometers northwest of TF-17, further convinced Fletcher fleet carriers were accompanying the invasion force. At 18:00, TF-17 completed fueling and Fletcher detached Neosho with a destroyer, Sims, to take station further south at a prearranged rendezvous, 158 degree. TF-17 then turned to head northwest towards Rossel Island in the Louisiades. Unbeknownst to the 2 adversaries, their carriers were only 70 NMI, 130 kilometers, away from each other by 20 kn that night. At 13 degrees 157 40 E, Hara reversed course to meet Takagi, who completed refueling and was now heading in Hara's direction. Late on 6 May, or early on 7 May, Kamikawa Maru set up a seaplane base in the Deboyne Islands in order to help provide air support for the invasion forces as they approached Port Moresby. The rest of Marumo's cover force then took station near the d'Entrecasteaux Islands to help screen Abe's oncoming convoy. Carrier battle. First day morning strikes at 06:25 on 7 May. TF-17 was 115 NMEI, 132 me, 13 kilometers south of Rossel Island, 13 degrees 20s, 154 d 21 E. At this time, Fletcher sent Crace's cruiser force, now designated Task Group 17.3, TG 17.3, to block the Jomard Passage. Fletcher understood that Crace would be operating without air cover, since TF-17's carriers would be busy trying to locate and attack the Japanese carriers. Detaching Crace reduced the anti-aircraft defenses for Fletcher's carriers. Nevertheless, Fletcher decided the risk was necessary to ensure the Japanese invasion forces could not slip through to Port Moresby while he engaged the carriers. Believing Takagi's carrier force was somewhere north of him, in the vicinity of the Louisiades beginning at 06:19, Fletcher directed Yorktown to send 10 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers as scouts to search that area. Hara, in turn, believed Fletcher was south of him and advised Takagi to send the aircraft to search that area. Takagi, about 300 NMI, 350 meters, 560 kilometers east of Fletcher, 13 degrees 12, 158 degrees 05 E, launched 12 Nakajima B-5Ns at 06 Dabasales to scout for TF-17. Around the same time, Goto's cruisers Kinugasa and Furutaka launched 4 Kawanishi E-7K2 Type 94 float planes to search southeast of the Louisiades. Augmenting their search were several float planes from Des Moines, 4 Kawanishi H-6Ks from Tulagi, and 3 Mitsubishi G4M bombers from Rabaul. Each side readied the rest of its carrier attack aircraft to launch immediately once the enemy was located. At 0722, one of Takagi's carrier scouts from Shōkaku reported U.S. ships bearing 102 just west of due south, Yanti-Senti-Ti-Mi, Yanti-Otinti-Ochimi, 302 kilometers from Takagi. At 0745, the scout confirmed that it had located 1 carrier, 1 cruiser, and 3 destroyers. Another Shōkaku scout aircraft quickly confirmed the sighting. The Shōkaku aircraft actually sighted and misidentified the oiler Neosho and destroyer Sims, which had earlier been detailed away from the fleet to a southern rendezvous point. Believing that he had located the U.S. carriers, Hara, with Takagi's concurrence, immediately launched all of his available aircraft. A total of 78 aircraft, 18 Zero fighters, 36 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, and 24 torpedo aircraft began launching from Shōkaku and Zuikaku at 08 and were on their way by 08:15 towards the reported sighting. The strike force was under overall command of Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, while Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led its torpedo bombers. At 08:20, one of the Furutaka aircraft found Fletcher's carriers and immediately reported it to Inoue's headquarters at Rabaul, which passed the report on to Takagi. The sighting was confirmed by a Kinugasa float plane at 08:30. Takagi and Hara, confused by the conflicting sighting reports they were receiving, decided to continue with the strike on the ships to their south, but turned their carriers towards the northwest to close the distance with Furutaka's reported contact. Takagi and Hara considered that the conflicting reports might mean that the U.S. carrier forces were operating in 2 separate groups. At 08:15, a Yorktown SBD piloted by John L. Nielsen sighted Goto's force screening the invasion convoy. Nielsen, making an error in his coded message, reported the sighting as 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers at 10°3's 152°7'E, 225 nmei, 259 mm, 417 kilometers northwest of TF-17. Fletcher concluded that the Japanese main carrier force was located and ordered the launch of all available carrier aircraft to attack. By 10:13, the U.S. strike of 93 aircraft, 18 Grumman F-4F Wildcats, 53 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and 22 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers was on its way. At 10:19, Nielsen landed and discovered his coding error. Although Goto's force included the light carrier Shōho, Nielsen thought that he saw 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, and thus the main fleet. At 10:12, Fletcher received a report of an aircraft carrier, 10 transports, and 16 warships, 30 nmei, 35 meti, 56 kilometers south of Nielsen's sighting at 10°35's 152°36'E. The B-17s actually saw the same thing as Nielsen. Shōho, Goto's cruisers plus the Port Moresby invasion force. Believing that the B-17's sighting was the main Japanese carrier force, which was in fact well to the east, Fletcher directed the airborne strike force towards this target. USS Neosho is left burning and slowly sinking at the completion of the Japanese dive bombing attack. At 09:15, Takahashi's strike force reached its target area, sighted Neosho and Sims, and searched in vain for the U.S. carriers for a couple of hours. Finally, at 10:51, Shōkaku scout air crews realized they were mistaken in their identification of the oiler and destroyer as aircraft carriers. Takagi now realized the U.S. carriers were between him and the invasion convoy, placing the invasion forces in extreme danger. At 11:15, the torpedo bombers and fighters abandoned the mission and headed back towards the carriers with their ordnance, while the 36 dive bombers attacked the 2 U.S. ships. 4 dive bombers attacked Sims, and the rest dived on Neosho. The destroyer was hit by 3 bombs, broke in half, and sank immediately, killing all but 14 of her 192-man crew. Neosho was hit by 7 bombs. One of the dive bombers, hit by anti-aircraft fire, crashed into the oiler. Heavily damaged and without power, Neosho was left drifting and slowly sinking, 16°09s, 158°03E. Before losing power, Neosho was able to notify Fletcher by radio that she was under attack and in trouble, but garbled any further details as to just who or what was attacking her and gave wrong coordinates, 16°25s, 157°31D for her position. The U.S. strike aircraft sighted Shōkaku, a short distance northeast of Mishima Island at 10:40, and deployed to attack. The Japanese carrier was protected by 4 Zeros and 2 Mitsubishi A-5M fighters flying Combat Air Patrol, CAP, as the rest of the carrier's aircraft were being prepared below decks for a strike against the U.S. carriers. Goto's cruisers surrounded the carrier in a diamond formation, 3,000, 5,000 wide, 2,700, 4,600 meter off each of Shōkaku's corners, attacking first. Lexington's air group, led by Commander William B. Alt, hit Shōkaku with 2 1,000 lb 450 kil bombs and 5 torpedoes, causing severe damage. At 11:00, Yorktown's air group attacked the burning and now almost stationary carrier, scoring with up to 11 more 1,000 lb 450 kilos of bombs and at least 2 torpedoes. Torn apart, Shōkaku sank at 11:35, 10D-29s 150D-55E. Fearing more air attacks, Goto withdrew his warships to the north, but sent the destroyer Sazanami back at 14 hours to rescue survivors. Only 203 of the carrier's 834-man crew were recovered. 3 U.S. aircraft were lost in the attack, 2 SBDs from Lexington and 1 from Yorktown. All of Shōkaku's aircraft complement of 18 was lost, but 3 of the CAP fighter pilots were able to ditch at Des Moines and survived. At 12:10, using a prearranged message to signal TF-17 on the success of the mission, Lexington SBD pilot and squadron commander Robert E. Dixon radioed, "Scratch 1 flat top." Signed, Bob. Afternoon operations. The U.S. aircraft returned and landed on their carriers by 13:38. By 14:20, the aircraft were rearmed and ready to launch against the Port Moresby invasion force, or Goto's cruisers. Fletcher was concerned that the locations of the rest of the Japanese fleet carriers were still unknown. He was informed that Allied intelligence sources believed that up to 4 Japanese carriers might be supporting the MO operation. Fletcher concluded that by the time his scout aircraft found the remaining carriers, it would be too late in the day to mount a strike. Thus, Fletcher decided to hold off on another strike this day and remain concealed under the thick overcast, with fighters ready in defense. Fletcher turned TF-17 southwest. Apprised of the loss of Shōkaku, Inoue ordered the invasion convoy to temporarily withdraw to the north and ordered Takagi, at this time located 225 nmi, 259 miles, 417 kilometers east of TF-17, to destroy the U.S. carrier forces. As the invasion convoy reversed course, it was bombed by 8 U.S. Army B-17s, but was not damaged. Goto and Kajioka were told to assemble their ships south of Russell Island for a night surface battle if the U.S. ships came within range at 12:40. A Des Moines-based seaplane sighted and reported Crace's detached cruiser and destroyer force on a bearing of 175 to 78 nmi, 90 min, 144 km from Des Moines. At 13:15, an aircraft from Rabaul sighted Crace's force but submitted an erroneous report stating the force contained 2 carriers and was located, bearing 205 dig, 115 nmi, 213 km from Des Moines. Based on these reports, Takagi, who was still awaiting the return of all of his aircraft from attacking Neosho, turned his carriers due west at 13:30 and advised Midway at 15 Fio that the U.S. carriers were at least 430 nmi, 490 meticulously, 800 kilometers west of his location, and that he would therefore be unable to attack them that day. Inouye's staff directed 2 groups of attack aircraft from Rabaul, already airborne since that morning, towards Crace's reported position. The first group included 12 torpedo-armed G4M bombers, and the second group comprised 19 Mitsubishi G3M land attack aircraft armed with bombs. Both groups found and attacked Crace's ships at 14:30 and claimed to have sunk a California-type battleship and damaged another battleship and cruiser. In reality, Crace's ships were lightly damaged and shot down 4 G4Ms. A short time later, 3 U.S. Army B-17s mistakenly bombed Crace, but caused no damage. At the conclusion of the attack, the detachment of cruisers suffered several wounded and a few men killed aboard the Chicago. Crace, at 15:26, radioed Fletcher. He could not complete his mission without air support. Crace retired southward to a position about 220 nmi, 250 mm, 410 km southeast of Port Moresby to increase the range from Japanese carrier or land-based aircraft while remaining close enough to intercept any Japanese naval forces advancing beyond the Louisiades through either the Jomard Passage or the China Strait. Crace's ships were low on fuel, and as Fletcher was maintaining radio silence and had not informed him in advance, Crace had no idea of Fletcher's location, status, or intentions. Shortly after 15 hours, Shōkaku monitored a message from a Des Moines-based reconnaissance aircraft reporting, incorrectly, that Crace's force had altered course to 120 degrees true, southeast. Takagi's staff assumed the aircraft was shadowing Fletcher's carriers and determined if the Allied ships held that course, they would be within striking range shortly before nightfall. Takagi and Hara were determined to attack immediately with a select group of aircraft, minus fighter escort, even though it meant the strike would return after dark. To try to confirm the location of the U.S. carriers, at 15:15 Hara sent a flight of 8 torpedo bombers as scouts to sweep 200 nmi, 230 m, 370 km westward. About that same time, the dive bombers that had attacked Neosho returned and landed. 6 of the weary dive bomber pilots were told they would be immediately departing on another mission. Choosing his most experienced crews, including Takahashi, Shimazaki and Lieutenant Tomotsuema, at 16:15, Hara launched 12 dive bombers and 15 torpedo planes with orders to fly on a heading of 277 degrees to 280 nmi, 320 meter, Midway. The 8 scout aircraft reached the end of their 200 nmi, 230 mm tests, 370 kilometers search leg, and turned back without seeing Fletcher's ships. At 17:47, TF-17, operating under thick overcast 200 nmi, 230 mm, 370 kilometers west of Takagi, detected the Japanese strike on radar heading in their direction, turned southeast into the wind and vectored 11 Cap Wildcats, led by Lieutenant Commanders Paul H. Ramsey and James H. Flatley, to intercept. Taking the Japanese formation by surprise, the Wildcats shot down 7 torpedo bombers and 1 dive bomber, and heavily damaged another torpedo bomber, which later crashed, at a cost of 3 Wildcats lost. USS Lexington, having taken heavy losses in the attack, which also scattered their formations, the Japanese strike leaders cancelled the mission after conferring by radio. The Japanese aircraft all jettisoned their ordnance and reversed course to return to their carriers. The sun set at 18:30. Several of the Japanese dive bombers encountered the U.S. carriers in the darkness, around 19 Frau, and briefly confused as to their identity, circled in preparation for landing before anti-aircraft fire from TF-17's destroyers drove them away. By 20, TF-17 and Takagi were about 100 nmi, 120 meters, over 90 km apart. Takagi turned on his warship's searchlights to help guide the 18 surviving aircraft back, and all were recovered by 22 hours. In the meantime, at 15:18 and 17:18, Neosho was able to radio TF-17. She was drifting northwest in dire straits. Neosho's 17:18 report gave wrong coordinates, which hampered subsequent U.S. rescue efforts to locate the oiler. More significantly, the news informed Fletcher his only nearby available fuel supply was gone. As nightfall ended aircraft operations for the day, Fletcher ordered TF-17 to head west and prepared to launch a 360-degree search at first light. Crace also turned west to stay within striking range of the Louisiades. Inoue directed Takagi to make sure he destroyed the U.S. carriers the next day and postponed the Port Moresby landings to 12th May.